This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast. This is Amy, and I hope you are somewhere cool, having some ice cream because it is hot outside. This is 4th of July week, and we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the country. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we sounded like back then. And I'm watching these documentaries about the Revolution. There's a really good one on Netflix right now that I believe Tom Hanks has produced. And I live in Virginia, which is one of the original 13 colonies, and so we have a lot of history here that goes all the way back to the Revolution. The county that I grew up in has some Revolutionary era history, and it makes me wonder, how did people in the colonies sound, and how different is it from the way that we sound today? That's just the kind of thing that language nerds like me think about. And I've talked about this before in the podcast, how we can use primary documents like letters and journals because people would write the way that they spoke. And we can compare that, to look at changes over time. But I wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive because we talked about this history in my last episode, my episode with Dr. Valerie Fridland, who wrote the book Why We Talk Funny, which is such a great book. And this was such a rich episode full of information. And I encourage you to go listen to it if you haven't already. You may even have to listen to it twice because it is packed full of historical facts. And we try to link all of that back to Appalachian speech and Southern speech in general and American speech, really. We talk about it all. So many of you have joined the Talkin' Appalachian community on Patreon, and I just want to welcome you. If you're thinking of subscribing to get bonus episodes, writing, my travelogues for places and spaces I visit throughout Appalachia, or anything else I only share with subscribers, then go on over to patreon.com/Talkin' Appalachian podcast. And if you choose to become a paid subscriber, that will unlock bonus episodes with literary luminaries like Barbara Kingsolver, Homer Hickam, and Jeanette Walls, my interview with an Appalachian Holocaust survivor, and some absolutely true ghost tales from my own family's vault. You'll also have early access to episodes like this one before they're published. Talkin' Appalachian podcast on Patreon. Settlement patterns, political affiliations, and industry have a lot to do with the distinctive qualities of Appalachian speech and the Southern speech in general. If we go back to settlement patterns and we think about Western Virginia and the Appalachian region being populated largely by Scots-Irish, the Irish, and North Midland English speakers, we talked about how those groups, their speech sounded different from Southern British English, which is the variety more closely associated with Shakespeare. And then at the same time, coastal Virginia, places like Tidewater and the Richmond area, were closely tied to Britain, especially London, because you had wealthy people building plantations in the flatlands, and they were going back and forth, and they wanted to maintain ties with the aristocracy. And so Dr. Fridland talked about how the early settlers, early colonists probably did have some Shakespearean traits, and that contributed a lot to this myth of Elizabethan English, Shakespearean English, and Appalachian English. But it wasn't long before all of that began to change. And you have to think about political affiliations, who people wanted to sound like and who people wanted to be like, because a lot of it had to do with that. New England was the prestige place. That's who a lot of the colonists wanted to be like and sound like. And so the New England accents were the prestige varieties, and that carried down through the flatlands of the colonies. Virginia is a very interesting state because you have in Appalachia and much of inland Virginia, you have what's called rhotic speech patterns. You hear the R clearly, both at the ends of words like water, shower, dollar, and in the middle of words that have no R like wash. That used to be the prestige way of speaking in Britain. And then it shifted. R-lessness, what you hear now in New England and in Britain, that was actually considered a speech trait of the working class. It was considered a vulgar way of speaking English, but then that completely changed. And it became the prestige way to say words with R's in them. So Appalachia remained rhotic, artful, because they didn't have a reason to stay aligned with London. They didn't have ties to the wealthy, and they had their own thing going on. And so that wasn't a necessary factor. You can still hear the R dropping in the coastal regions of Virginia. And I think that's really interesting because it goes all the way back to early settlements. But the surprising thing is early Americans pronounced their R's everywhere. And this R dropping, of course, didn't become widespread until later when people realized it was fashionable. It's a continuation of early American speech. Now, let's think about geography, too. The Appalachian Mountains weren't easy to cross, and even though I hesitate to use the word isolated because I think people take it too far now, they still call us isolated, even though that's ridiculous. In the beginning, the communities were more isolated, and if you read enough about them, you see that they were self-isolating in a lot of ways, too. Social networks were very tight. People interacted in smaller, concentrated, consistent groups, communities. But wealthier coastal Virginians had more mobility. Wealthier coastal New Englanders had more mobility, traveling back and forth to Britain, maintaining those cultural ties, and again, modeling their speech on what they heard in London. Now, if you fast forward a little bit to the Civil War letters give us a glimpse into how language changed even more by the 19th century and how persistent those features were. If you go back a few episodes, you'll find one that I did on a study of Civil War letters compared to letters written 100 years later in Appalachia. Both writers had very little formal writing instruction, and so they wrote the way that they spoke, and you can hear how they might have sounded. They're using the same grammar patterns, the same words, the same pronunciations that would have been spoken a century earlier, like the Scots-Irish might could, as in I might could help you tomorrow, or the Southern British a prefix, like I'm a-going to the fair, or I'm a-worrying about that test, or like to, as in I like to fell out of the bed, as in I almost fell out of the bed. And that came from Southern Britain and in Scotland, according to linguist Michael Montgomery. Dr. Montgomery also wrote about the Confederados, a group of thousands, some 20,000 Southern expatriates who left the United States for Brazil after the Civil War ended. Now, they were disillusioned by the prospect of life in the United States, and they were lured to Brazil with promises of land by Emperor Dom Pedro II. And while a lot of them ended up returning to the United States due to homesickness and other factors, those who stayed eventually did prosper in a community they called Americana. Dr. Montgomery and his co-author, C.A. Milo, studied interviews conducted in the mid-1970s with 11 descendants of the Americana settlers to see how much of 19th century Southern American English traits were still present in their speech. And the reason they were interested in this is because President Jimmy Carter visited Americana in 1972, and he gave a speech to an audience of about 200 descendants of the Confederados. And he talked about how surprised he was that they sounded like they were from Georgia. They sounded very Southern. So what Dr. Montgomery and Milo found was that even though the Americana settlers intermarried and learned Portuguese, meaning they and their descendants were bilingual, the 1970s Americana speech more closely resembled the 19th century vernacular speech patterns of the Confederados than the 20th century standard American speech patterns. So it was preserved. Much of that had to do with their community's isolation and this strong sense of regional identity, which was a key to much of the speech preservation after the Civil War. It sort of, for many reasons, wanted to, maybe in defiance of losing, or I don't know, but they wanted to maintain very close cultural ties with their region, and language was part of that. Now, this study was done in 1990, Montgomery's study. So it would be interesting to know, and he even ends it with this statement, it would be interesting to know if more recent studies have been done with later generations to see how persistent, like, is it carrying forward in the later generations? Do they also sound Southern, or has it completely gone away by now? That would be something interesting and something I'm going to look into. There's way more to this story, and you can bet I'm going to do a deeper dive in a later episode. But coming back to Virginia, what we hear in Virginia today reflects more than just, different accents. Again, we're thinking about migration and economy and class and identity and who people choose or refuse to sound like. And what makes Appalachian Englishes unique isn't that they're older or simpler, but that they developed in their own direction and preserved some old patterns along the way. That matters because there's a persistent myth that Appalachian Englishes are backwards or a broken version of Standard English. They're not. I've said this so many times before on the podcast. They're fully developed dialects with their own rules and history and logic, just like any other. There's one more distinction that Dr. Fridland and I talk about that helps clarify all this, and that's the difference between dialect and slang. And I bring this up again because I just saw a pretty prominent publication online do a post about how words are mispronounced. And they gave a list of words and said that these are the words that Southerners mispronounce. That's inaccurate because it's not a mispronunciation. It's vernacular dialect. And people do the same thing when they call Appalachian Englishes or Southern Englishes or any dialect, when they call it slang. It is not slang. It is a complete system of speech with grammar patterns, pronunciation patterns, and vocabulary. Slang is something different entirely. It's temporary. It's often driven by younger speakers. It's creative and it's fast-moving and it's constantly changing. So if your teenager uses a word and tells you never to say that word because you're too old, then that's slang, right? That's how you can tell a difference. Dialect is not disposable. Slang is. It's here today, gone tomorrow. 250 years later, we're reflecting on the written word in documents like the Declaration, which I could do a whole episode on because the Declaration of Independence is a really fascinating document. And I teach it in my rhetoric class. It is really interesting. It has a interesting background, but the way that it's worded is really fascinating. But America has never spoken with just one voice. I mean, Appalachian speech, Southern speech, all vernacular dialects are living records of American history being spoken every single day. As we mark this anniversary, just listen closely to the voices around you and think about what that means, especially the voices where you live, especially if they're regional voices. There's so much history, layers and layers of history there, so much of it. And to dismiss it as slang or mispronunciation, I mean, to a linguist, that's just blasphemy. But that's why I do this podcast, so that I can, get that information out there and let people know that this is really how we should be thinking about it, because how we talk about it and the words that we use to talk about our voice place matters. Because when we're talking about voice, we're talking about the people who use those voices, speak those words. As we approach 4th of July, I just want to tell you, have a happy 250th, happy birthday to America. And I hope wherever you are that you're celebrating and enjoying your fireworks. That's how some of us in Appalachia pronounce it, fireworks. Thanks for listening. And remember, keep talking Appalachian.